All right, so today we are diving into a book that I think a lot of people talk about, but maybe not as many have actually read. Karl Marx's Capital, Volume I.
Yeah,
And I get it. It's one of those books that, maybe you had to read in college, or maybe you just felt like you should read at some point.
right.
And it's dense, and it's kind of daunting, and it's economics, which a lot of people, maybe think is a little dry.
Yeah, not the most accessible book.
No, not really a page turner.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to make it interesting today because it's actually, I think, really, really relevant still today. And we're going to be looking at excerpts from Capital, Volume I. And
Mhm.
specifically, we're going to be looking at, chapters on commodities and money and the working day
Right.
and machinery and the accumulation of capital, kind of like the big hitters.
Yeah, the big ideas.
Yeah, and our mission today is to sort of extract the core arguments from this book in a way that's um, understandable
Yeah.
and free of jargon and kind of see why this book is still relevant. And I think it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so interesting about Marx is that he really is trying to get at these like fundamental mechanisms of capitalism
Yeah,
that are still very much in play today.
absolutely.
Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, I think just understanding his analysis is really valuable.
Yeah, and he doesn't waste any time. Like he kind of jumps right into it. And one of the things that struck me, and I just wanted to point this out right at the beginning, is that he dedicates the book to a citizen,
Right.
which I thought was kind of an interesting choice.
Yeah, it's not to like, his academic advisor
Right,
or
right.
or his colleagues or something like that.
Exactly. It's a very deliberate choice. And I think it speaks to this idea that Marx really saw his work as part of a larger social movement.
Well,
It wasn't just about detached scholarship. It was about trying to empower people with this knowledge.
okay, so he's not messing around. He's going for it.
No, he's not messing around.
So let's jump into it then.
Okay.
So one of the things that he talks about in Capital is this distinction between use value and exchange value.
Right.
And I always kind of stumble over those terms a little bit. So I'm wondering if you can maybe just give us a real world example that might help.
Yeah, so think about something like your smartphone, right?
Okay.
Like its use value is pretty obvious, right? It's communication, it's
Yeah.
entertainment, you can use it for all sorts of things.
Um, but then there's its exchange value, right? Which is how
Yes.
much you paid for it, how much you could sell it for.
Right.
And for Marx, that's where things get really interesting.
Because it's not just about the phone itself, it's about all the labor that went into it.
Exactly. The use value is very straightforward, but the exchange value is where all these social relations get masked, right?
Okay.
Like who mined the materials, who assembled the phone, who shipped it, all of that is kind of hidden behind the price tag.
Right.
And this is what Marx calls commodity fetishism.
Okay. Commodity fetishism. Now I'm really confused.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
So it's like we give these objects like some kind of weird power over us.
In a way, yeah, it's like we become fixated on the things themselves,
Mm-hmm.
the brands, the prices, the perceived status, but we forget about all the people who made those things possible.
And often the conditions under which they made those things.
Exactly, and the often exploitative labor relations that underpin their production.
Right. So Marx is saying we're all kind of blinded by the shiny objects.
In a sense, yeah.
And he's also got this interesting quote about money, where he says, money is dirt, although dirt is not money.
Yeah, that's a classic Marx quote.
And I have to admit, when I first read that, I was like, wait, is he saying money is meaningless?
Yeah, it sounds kind of counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but what he's getting at is this idea that money has this dual nature.
Okay.
So on the one hand, it can be a commodity itself, right, like gold or silver.
Right, like we used to have.
Exactly.
Mm.
But it's also this representation of value. It's a symbol that we've all agreed upon.
Hmm.
And it's this kind of dual nature that gives money its power.
Okay, so it's both real and kind of made up at the same time. Exactly. It's a social construct as much as it is a material thing.
Okay, so how does that work with, like, yeah, because now we've got, digital currency and all this kind of stuff.
Right. And that's what's so interesting is that the form of money can change, right?
Right.
It can be gold coins. It can be paper money. It can be ones and zeros on a screen.
Right.
But the underlying function, in Marx's view, stays pretty consistent.
Look.
It's still this medium of exchange. It's still this way to measure value, and it's still a way to store wealth.
So even though I'm just like tapping my phone to pay for things,
Mhm.
all those like underlying dynamics are still in play.
Exactly.
It's all still happening behind the scenes.
Exactly. So
So,
the form changes, but the essence remains the same.
okay, this is starting to make a little bit more sense now.
Good.
But I feel like we've just scratched the surface here.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. There's a lot more to unpack.
this is just the tip of the iceberg.
So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into Capital, Volume I.
So, we were talking about money as this representation of value, this kind of common denominator in this whole system of capitalist exchange.
Right, and how it kind of obscures all these social relations behind it.
Exactly. And that leads us to another crucial aspect of capital, which is Marx's analysis of the working day itself.
Okay.
And he doesn't just talk about it in these kind of general terms. He really gets into the nitty-gritty of, how work is structured, how time is measured.
Right, because time is money.
Exactly. And he introduces these concepts of necessary labor and surplus labor, which I know can sound a little bit like accounting jargon.
Yeah, a little bit. Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, so imagine a worker on an assembly line, right? Necessary labor is the portion of their day that they spend producing enough value to cover their own wages.
Okay, so basically the cost of their own survival.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
It's like the bare minimum they need to produce just to stay afloat. Surplus labor, on the other hand, is all that extra time, that extra value they produce that goes straight into the capitalist pocket as profit.
So it's like they're working for free, essentially, during that surplus labor time.
That's how Marx sees it. And to really drive this point home, he doesn't just use abstract examples.
Oh.
He dives into really gritty historical details.
Right, he talks about, like, the fight for the 10 hours bill.
Exactly. Like back in 19th century England, factory owners were working people like sometimes 14, 16 hours a day.
Oh my gosh.
It was brutal. And the 10 hours bill was this huge deal because it was a rare win for the working class. It showed that they could actually force the government to intervene and kind of regulate the worst excesses of capitalism.
So even back then, there was this recognition that, unfettered capitalism wasn't exactly a party for the working class.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's really important to remember when we're reading Capital today. Marx is writing in this specific historical context.
Right.
But the issues he's grappling with are still very much with us.
Totally. So it's not just ancient history.
Not at all. And, speaking of history, another concept that Marx talks about that I think is really relevant here is this idea of primitive accumulation.
Okay, primitive accumulation. That sounds kind of intense.
It does sound intense, right?
Yeah, like something out of the Stone Age.
Right. It makes you think of like, cavemen and stuff. But it's actually super relevant to understanding how capitalism works, even today.
Okay, I'm listening.
So basically, primitive accumulation refers to that initial process by which the preconditions for capitalism were established.
Well, like the enclosure of the commons and all that.
Exactly, like forcing peasants off their land and into factories, colonizing vast territories for resources and labor, all of that messy, often violent stuff that kind of lays the groundwork for capitalism to emerge.
So it's kind of like the original sin of capitalism in a way.
In a way, yeah. And here's the kicker. Marx argues that primitive accumulation isn't just some ancient history. It's an ongoing process.
What do you mean?
He's saying that capitalism is constantly finding new ways to create those conditions of dispossession and exploitation.
Give me some examples.
Think about the privatization of public resources, like water or education or healthcare.
Okay.
Think about the displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands for mining or logging.
Right.
Think about the exploitation of cheap labor in developing countries to produce goods for Western markets. These are all examples of how primitive accumulation is still happening all around us.
So it's like this constant cycle of, taking from some to give to others.
Exactly. And that's why Marx argues that capitalism can never be truly just or equitable, because it's built on this foundation of inequality and exploitation.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to process, but I'm starting to see how all these different pieces fit together.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but once you start to see those patterns, it's hard to unsee them.
It really is.
And that's kind of the power of Marx's analysis,
Yeah.
right? It helps us to understand not just how things are, but how they came to be this way.
Right, and maybe how they could be different.
Exactly.
All right, so we're back with the final stretch of our deep dives into Karl Marx's Capital Volume I. And, we've been talking about these sort of big structural forces of capitalism, things like primitive accumulation and the reserve army of labor.
Right, kind of laying the groundwork.
Yeah, but I'm wondering now if we can maybe zoom in a little bit and talk about how these forces actually affect individuals on like a personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think one of the things that Marx does so well is he's able to connect those like big picture economic trends to the lived experiences of everyday people.
Right.
And one of the key concepts he uses to do this is this idea of alienation.
Okay, alienation. Now, I have to admit, when I hear that word, I think like, existential crisis.
Laughs. Yeah, it does have kind of a dramatic ring to it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But Marx's concept of alienation is actually very specific, and it's all about how capitalism distorts our relationship to our work, to the things we create, and even to each other.
Okay, so it's not just about feeling alienated from like, the meaning of life.
Right, it's much more grounded than that. It's about how the very structure of capitalist society makes it difficult for us to find fulfillment and connection in our daily lives.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What are the different layers of this alienation thing?
So Marx identifies four main types of alienation. The first one is alienation from the product of our labor.
Okay, so like if I'm working on an assembly line all day, I might not even know what I'm building or care.
Exactly. Or you might be building something that you yourself could never afford to buy.
Right, like a luxury car or something.
Exactly. So there's this disconnect between the work you're doing and the actual thing that's being produced.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What's the second type of alienation?
The second type is alienation from the process of labor. So under capitalism, work is often broken down into these really specialized, repetitive tasks.
Right, think about like a factory worker or someone entering data all day.
Exactly. And this can lead to a sense of detachment from the work itself. You're not really using your creativity, your problem-solving skills. You're just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah, it's like you become a robot almost.
In a way, yeah. And that's actually a key part of Marx's argument. He's saying that capitalism reduces human beings to these kind of cogs in a machine.
That's a pretty bleak way to think about work.
It is, but unfortunately, I think it resonates with a lot of people's experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got alienation from the product of labor, alienation from the process of labor. What's next?
So the third type of alienation is a little bit more abstract, but I think it's really important. It's alienation from our species being.
Okay, species being. Now you're just messing with me.
Laughs. I know it sounds kind of out there, but bear with me. What Marx means by species being is essentially our human nature, our capacity for creativity, for cooperation, for connection with the natural world.
Okay.
And his argument is that capitalism alienates us from our species being because it reduces us to our economic function. It treats us as just units of labor rather than as whole complex beings with a variety of needs and desires.
So it's like we're all just cogs in a machine, and the machine doesn't really care about our happiness or our well-being.
Exactly. It just cares about whether or not we're producing profits.
Right. Okay, that's pretty depressing. But I guess that's why we're reading Marx, right? To kind of shine a light on these uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. Because once you start to see these patterns, you can't unsee them. And that can be really empowering.
Okay, so what's the fourth and final type of alienation?
The fourth type is alienation from other people. And this one might seem a little counterintuitive at first because, we live in a very social world.
Right.
But Marx argues that capitalism actually fosters competition and distrust among workers.
Because we're all competing for the same jobs and same resources.
Exactly. And this can make it really hard to build solidarity, to organize collectively, to fight for better conditions. Because we're constantly being pitted against each other.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. And this alienation from each other, it's not just bad for workers, it's also bad for society as a whole.
Yeah.
Because it undermines our sense of community, our ability to connect with and care for one another.
Okay, so that's alienation in a nutshell. 4 different flavors of capitalist misery.
Laughs. Pretty much. But like I said before, I don't think Marx's goal was to just bum everyone out.
Right, he wanted to change things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He believed that by understanding how capitalism works, by seeing those systems of oppression and exploitation that are often hidden in plain sight, we could start to imagine and fight for something better.
A world without alienation.
A world where work is not just a means to an end, but a source of fulfillment and creativity. A world where we're not defined by our economic status, but by our shared humanity.
That's a world I think a lot of us would like to live in.
Me too. And I think Marx would say that it's a world worth fighting for.
Well said. Well, folks, there you have it. A crash course in Karl Marx's Capital volume. We've covered a lot of ground today, from commodities and money to alienation and the reserve army of labor.
And we've barely scratched the surface.
Right. But hopefully this deep dive has given you some food for thought, some new lenses through which to view the world around you.
Because as Marx himself would say, the point isn't just to interpret the world, the point is to change it.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the finer points of capitalist critique. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those contradictions in check.